My name is Daniel Whittaker, and I serve as a park ranger in Alaska. That introduction may sound simple enough, almost sterile in its formality. But the reality behind those words is far from simple. I was not born here, though I suspect the land has been waiting for me far longer than I have walked upon it. Alaska is not just another stretch of wilderness where maps and regulations keep people safe. It is a place that resists being known, a place that tolerates human presence the way an old wolf tolerates a thorn in its paw. Annoyed, patient for a time, but always capable of shaking it free with a violent jerk. My work as a ranger is meant to be practical, guiding lost hikers, maintaining trails, monitoring wildlife. But beneath those ordinary duties lies an unspoken system of rules. Rules as old as the trees, older perhaps than language, and it is those rules that keep me alive. When I first accepted the posting, I had believed myself ready. I had already served in the National Park Service for 8 years, stationed in different parts of the continental United States. I had worked in Montana, Wyoming, and briefly in Colorado, and I thought I knew wilderness. I knew storms that tore apart tent lines, bears that prowled camp perimeters, avalanches that roared without warning. I thought I had been tested. Yet when the transfer letter came offering me a position at a northern Alaskan park, whose acreage seemed boundless, I understood that this was different. They did not assign rangers here lightly. Men and women who came seldom stayed long, and those who did never returned unchanged. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the silence. It was not the gentle quiet of a forest or the restful hush of a meadow. It was a deeper thing, the kind of silence that seems carved from stone, heavy and watchful. The locals, the few who lived on the park's edge, treated the land with a kind of wary reverence. They spoke to me only briefly when I passed through their town. Some nodded in respect. Others shook their heads as if pitying me. One old woman pressed a small carved figure of a raven into my hand and whispered, "Keep it with you when the dark stretches long." I laughed politely, but her eyes told me she was not joking. On my first night in the ranger station, the head ranger, a man named Carlisle, handed me a thin packet of papers. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes sunken but sharp. He told me these papers contained rules I was expected to follow. Not guidelines for tourists, not standard issue safety manuals, but rules for survival. He emphasized the word. I remember holding the pages thinking it was some initiation prank. The rules were typed neatly, each line blunt, almost childish in its simplicity. 1. Never leave food outside overnight, no matter how secure you believe it to be. 2. When you hear whistling in the trees, do not respond. 3. If you see someone who looks like another ranger, but whose uniform is wrong, do not speak to them. Walk away without running. 4. Carry extra batteries, but never use a flashlight after 3 in the morning. 5. Never follow lanterns off the trail. 6. If the radio picks up your own voice when you have not spoken, turn it off immediately and wait until morning. 7. The river changes paths. Memorize the stars, not the banks. 8. Do not linger at the tree line after dusk. 9. Remember that the silence is not empty. Treat it as you would a crowded room. 10. When in doubt, leave offerings, tobacco, salt, or bread, left in places where the forest feels heaviest. I read them twice, then looked at Carlisle for explanation. He only said, "Follow them. Every one. If you don't, you won't last the winter." His tone was devoid of humor. I tucked the papers into my jacket pocket and said nothing more. It was not until weeks later that I would understand how literal those words were. The days were long in that season, stretched by summer's reach, and the sunlight refused to leave even late into the night. For a time I convinced myself the rules were superstitions, stories designed to keep rangers cautious in an unforgiving environment. I busied myself with ordinary work, clearing fallen branches from trails, inspecting cabins that stood empty except for the occasional mouse nest, recording sightings of moose and caribou. I slept soundly in my bunk and woke to coffee and the hiss of the station's old heater. Normal things, comforting things. But the normalcy did not last. It never does here. The first test of the rules came in the form of sound. It was past midnight, and I had lingered at my desk to complete a wildlife report. The station was quiet except for the scratch of my pen and the hum of the lamp. That was when I heard it whistling. Not cheerful, not tuneful, but thin and deliberate, rising from the trees beyond the window. At first I thought it might be Carlosel returning late from a patrol, signaling his presence. But then I remembered the paper in my pocket. Rule 2, do not respond. The sound carried on, weaving between high and low notes, echoing faintly through the timber. It seemed to wait between phrases, as though expecting me to answer back. I gripped my pen harder and tried to steady my breathing. After several minutes, it faded. When I stepped outside at dawn, the ground was disturbed beneath the pines. Not footprints exactly, but something had pressed patterns into the earth. Long, narrow depressions that did not match boots' paws or hooves. I kept my discovery to myself. The second test arrived weeks later when I hiked out to one of the park's northern cabins. The trail was rough, barely marked, and often swallowed by undergrowth. The air was sharp with the scent of spruce. I carried my pack loaded with food, water, and spare batteries, and by evening I reached the cabin. It was weathered but intact, its shutters rattling in the wind. As I set my gear inside, I noticed something moving on the tree line. A flicker of yellow light, faint but unmistakable. A lantern. Someone was out there, weaving through the shadows, too far to make out clearly, but close enough for me to know they were not part of my patrol. The light bobbed as if held by a hand, then was joined by another and another, until 3 lanterns glowed in a row. They swayed together, as if dancing. I nearly called out before I remembered Rule 5. Never follow lanterns off the trail. My throat tightened. The lights lingered for several minutes, drifting parallel to the cabin. And then they vanished, extinguished all at once. The darkness that followed seemed even heavier than before. I locked the cabin door and did not step outside again until dawn. The snow that morning was disturbed by long trails, not footprints but drag marks, as though something heavy had been pulled in circles around the cabin all night. Carlosel said little when I reported my findings. He only nodded and asked if I had followed. When I told him no, he clapped my shoulder and said, "Good, you're learning." Then he left the room. That was the end of it. I began to realize then that the rules were not strange at all. They were necessary. Every day brought reminders that this park was not merely wilderness, but something older, more deliberate, more aware. I carried offerings in my pack, salt, bits of bread, and tobacco leaves sealed in a pouch. When the silence pressed too thick, when the trees seemed to crowd too close, I would leave one on a stump or bury it beneath moss. I never lingered to see if anything took them. It was enough to know the pressure lifted afterward, the air easing as if a held breath had been released. Still, doubt clung to me. Some nights I convinced myself it was my imagination, tricks of fatigue and isolation. Yet that doubt died the evening I heard my own voice on the radio. It was late August, and I was stationed near the southern river bend, keeping track of water levels. I carried the old Ranger-issued radio, static crackling as I checked in every hour. At dusk, as the sky bled orange, I turned the dial to confirm frequency. That was when the sound emerged. Not static, not another Ranger, but me. My voice, my cadence, my very words. Repeating the entry I had spoken earlier that day. River level holding steady, south bend clear. It said, though I had not pressed the button to transmit. The sound chilled me more deeply than any winter wind. I remembered Rule 6. If the radio picks up your own voice, turn it off immediately and wait until morning. My fingers trembled as I switched it off. For the rest of the night, I sat in silence, clutching the raven carving the old woman had given me, waiting for the dawn to return. When morning finally came, the riverbank had shifted, the water carving a new path. Rule 7. The river changes. Trust the stars, not the banks. I looked skyward, and for the first time, I felt the faintest hint of gratitude that someone before me had written these rules down, that I was not walking blind. That was only the beginning. That was only the beginning. I would come to learn that Alaska does not reveal its teeth all at once. It lets you grow comfortable, lets you think you understand its moods. And then, just as you let down your guard, it reminds you that you are a guest here, an uninvited one at that. The rules were not only for the sake of tradition. They were lifelines, each one hammered into me by experience I could not deny. September crept in colder than I had expected. Nights stretched longer, and the park's silence grew heavier, more crowded somehow. Carlisle warned me that autumn was the season when the land shifted most violently. Trails changed, rivers bent themselves, and sometimes whole ridges seemed to appear where the maps showed none. Don't trust memory, he told me as we checked gear before heading in opposite directions for patrol. Trust the rules. It was during one of those patrols that I encountered what I can only describe as a test of my own nerves. I had set out before sunrise, intending to inspect a stretch of the northern boundary. The air was brittle, the kind that makes your lungs ache when you breathe too deeply. Frost glittered across the grass, and each footfall echoed louder than it should have in the open space. I kept to the trail as best I could, though more often than not it vanished under fallen needles or turned in directions that contradicted my compass. By midday, I stopped to rest, sitting against a boulder where the sun reached through the trees. That was when I heard footsteps. Not the shuffle of animals, not the delicate crack of twigs, but heavy, deliberate strides, boots against earth. I stood at once, hand brushing the bear spray on my belt, and looked toward the sound. A man was approaching from the far side of the trail. He wore a ranger's uniform, but it was wrong, too dark, the green almost black, and the patches sewn in the wrong places. His hat was pulled low, hiding most of his face. Something about the way he walked made my skin crawl. His arms swung stiffly, as if each movement was being pulled by strings. I remembered Rule 3. If you see someone who looks like another ranger, but whose uniform is wrong, do not speak to them. Walk away without running. My throat tightened. Instinct screamed to challenge him, to ask who he was and what he was doing out there. But the memory of Carlisle's voice steadied me. I turned calmly, forcing my legs to carry me down the trail at a measured pace. I did not look back. My ears strained, catching the faint sound of those boots continuing behind me, following. Every nerve screamed to run, but I kept walking, steady, controlled. Eventually the sound faded, and when I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, the trail was empty. Only trees, standing too close together, watching. I never told Carlisle about that encounter. Something in me felt that speaking it aloud would give it strength. The days that followed grew stranger still. Tourists had thinned out by then, leaving the park nearly empty except for us rangers. Yet I often caught glimpses of movement where none should have been. Once at dusk, I saw a child crouched by the riverbank, her hair dark and matted. She was stacking stones into a perfect spiral. When I stepped closer, she lifted her head, and though her mouth was moving, no sound reached me. I blinked, and she was gone. The spiral of stones remained. I left an offering there, bread wrapped in cloth, and did not disturb the stones. Another time, near the southern ridge, I found the remains of a campfire. The embers were still warm, but no one was there. Around the fire were chairs, folding ones, too new to have been left long, and in one chair rested a jacket. I lifted it gingerly. It was dry clean, as if just taken from a closet. I set it back down and walked away quickly. Later that week, I passed the same ridge again. The campfire was gone, the clearing undisturbed, no sign of chairs or jackets. The ground bore no evidence that anything had ever stood there. It was during this season that Carlisle finally opened up to me. We were stationed at the central cabin for the week, the two of us sitting by the stove while snow dusted the windows. He spoke slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "These rules," he said, "they're older than me, older than my father even. They aren't ours. They're the forest's terms, and we either respect them or we disappear. That's the bargain." I asked him how many rangers had disappeared. He didn't answer, not directly. He only said, "Enough that the list of names fills more than one plaque, and some never made it to a plaque at all." Then he told me about the whistling, how once, long ago, a new ranger had whistled back in jest. They found his gear a week later, neatly stacked beside the trail. They never found him. That night I lay awake in my bunk, listening to the creaks of the cabin. His words replayed in my head. A bargain. That was what it felt like. The land demanding respect in exchange for mercy. Not safety, never safety, but mercy. Enough to keep us alive another day. By late September, the true dark began. The kind of night that stretches long, swallowing whole days. With the dark came new dangers. Rule 4 became crucial: carry extra batteries. But never use a flashlight after 3 in the morning. I learned quickly why. One night I broke the rule, and I regret it still. I had woken in the cabin to a noise outside. A scraping, faint but steady, circling the building. Carlisle was gone on a separate patrol, leaving me alone. I checked the clock. 3:30 in the morning. My instincts told me to wait until dawn, but the noise continued, insistent, as if whatever was outside was drawing lines into the wood. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, stark and thin. I moved to the window and lifted the curtain. The light revealed shapes, not animals, not people, but outlines that seemed carved from the dark itself. They crouched low, their forms shifting like smoke, and when the beam touched them, their heads snapped toward me in unison. Eyes shone back, not like animal eyes, but like mirrors catching fire. My stomach lurched. I dropped the curtain and shut off the flashlight at once, my heart pounding in my chest. The scraping outside ceased, replaced by silence thick enough to choke me. I sat in that silence until dawn finally bled gray into the sky. When I dared to look again, the cabin's wooden walls bore long grooves, carved deep, circling the entire structure. I never used a flashlight past 3 again. October came cruel and sharp. The snow thickened, and the trails all but disappeared. I carried salt more often, sprinkling it where the silence pressed hardest. I followed the stars as Carlisle had instructed, never trusting the river's path. I found that when I obeyed the rules, the land tolerated me. It did not grow friendlier. Alaska is never friendly, but it allowed me to walk without immediate consequence. That allowance became a strange kind of comfort. Still, the land sought ways to remind me of my place. One evening, returning to the station after a long patrol, I found the door ajar. Inside, the lights were on, though I had left them off. On the table sat my radio, humming faintly. I approached cautiously, my boots creaking against the floorboards. The radio crackled, then spoke in my own voices. "Daniel Whittaker. Do you hear me?" The sound repeated, looping endlessly, until I switched the device off and yanked the cord from the wall. I could not shake the feeling that the voice had been waiting for me, calling me back to myself. I left tobacco by the doorway that night, an offering to whatever had borrowed my name. Carlisle returned the next morning and saw the unease on my face. He asked nothing. He only nodded at the unlit radio and said, "Good. You didn't listen long." His approval carried no comfort. It only confirmed my suspicion that the rules were never arbitrary, and breaking them meant more than danger. It meant invitation. And invitations in this place were never meant for survival. As the season deepened, the rules became more than words on paper. They became instinct. I found myself reciting them silently as I walked the trails, a litany that kept me grounded. Never leave food outside. Do not respond to whistling. Do not speak to the wrong uniform. Do not use flashlights past 3. Each rule was a stone, and I clung to them as the darkness lengthened. One evening, while stationed again at the northern cabin, I witnessed something that made me question whether the rules were even enough. I had just finished setting the stove for warmth when the lanterns appeared again, swaying deep in the trees. This time there were more, 5, maybe 6, lined in a row. They moved slowly, deliberately, forming a path that led away from the cabin. My breath caught. I turned away, refusing to watch. But when I glanced back moments later, the lanterns were closer, just beyond the clearing, swaying in perfect rhythm. I shut the shutters and bolted the door, my heart hammering. All night I heard faint footsteps circling, never approaching, never leaving. At dawn, the snow bore no marks. The rules had kept me alive so far, but I began to fear that one day they would not be enough. The land felt hungrier, the silence heavier, the dark thicker. Each day was a gamble, and each night a prayer whispered into a void that never answered. I began to wonder if Carlisle was right, that survival here was never about strength or skill. It was about obedience, about respecting a bargain I never agreed to but was bound to nonetheless. And then came November, when the park finally showed me just how thin the line between survival and disappearance truly was. November settled in with a weight that felt less like weather and more like judgment. The dark arrived faster each evening, wrapping itself around the station before I had finished my notes. Snow deepened along the ridges, covering trails, smothering landmarks, and replacing them with an endless sameness that tested memory and nerve. Each step into that white expanse carried risk, but staying inside for too long was its own kind of trap. The park demands presence. It does not allow complacency. Carlisle grew quieter as the days shortened. He was never much for conversation, but now he spoke in clipped phrases, his eyes darting often toward the windows, as though expecting them to split open. I asked him once if the rules changed with the season. He shook his head and said, "They don't change, they only get stricter." He would not elaborate. I did not push. The weight in his voice told me that explanations only led to dread. It was during one of my solo patrols that the truth of his words struck me. I had ventured north along a ridge that overlooked the frozen river. The stars burned fiercely in the sky, guiding me more reliably than any trail markers. The river below glimmered silver, frozen in some places but restless in others, shifting its course as though alive. I paused to take notes, my breath fogging in the bitter air, when I heard it again whistling. It rose sharp and clear, closer than it had ever been before. My body stiffened, every muscle taut. I forced myself not to answer, not to even twitch in acknowledgement. The sound wove through the trees, circling me like a predator. Then, abruptly, it stopped. When I dared to glance over my shoulder, a figure stood between the pines, too far for detail, yet I could see its posture, leaning slightly forward, head tilted, waiting. I lowered my gaze, packed my notebook, and began walking. Each step felt like pressing against a current, my instincts screaming to flee. But I obeyed the rule. I walked, measured and steady, until the ridge curved and the figure was lost from sight. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I whispered under my breath, "Offerings. Always offerings." I left Salt on a stump as soon as I was able. That night, when I returned to the station, Carlisle eyed me with a kind of knowing sadness. "You didn't answer," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. I only nodded, too drained to ask how he knew. He muttered, "Good," and poured himself another cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the mug. The deeper the month went, the more the silence changed. It was no longer just heavy, it was layered. At times I felt as though voices hid within it, dozens of them, muffled just beyond hearing. When I stopped to listen closely, the silence seemed to draw tighter, pressing against my ears, as if punishing my curiosity. The rules never said anything about listening too hard, but I knew better than to pry. This land thrives on attention. Give it too much, and it takes more than you intended. One evening, near the midpoint of November, Carlisle left me alone at the central station while he checked a southern boundary. I prepared myself for the long night by stoking the stove, arranging offerings, and reciting the rules under my breath like scripture. Midnight passed uneventfully. At 2 in the morning, however, the radio clicked on by itself. The static was faint, but beneath it came a voice. My voice. It whispered my name over and over until the sound grew warped, guttural, no longer my own. I turned the radio off at once, but the whisper continued, not from the device, but from the very walls of the station. It slithered across the wooden beams, sliding beneath the door, crawling through the cracks. I sat frozen, clutching the raven carving in one hand, whispering prayers I had not spoken in years. At last, just before dawn, the whisper ceased. When Carlisle returned, I told him nothing. He would see it in my eyes anyway. Later that week, I learned the truth of another rule: do not linger at the tree line after dusk. I had stayed late checking a trail marker, the sun bleeding out behind me, when I realized I was standing exactly where forest met open snow. The trees loomed high, their branches reaching like claws. I felt the shift at once. The silence thickening, the air growing still. From the corner of my eye, shadows slid between trunks, not walking but gliding, stretching taller than they should. My throat went dry. Slowly, I stepped backward, keeping my gaze on the ground until the trees were no longer at my side, but behind me entirely. Only then did the pressure lift. I left an offering of tobacco in the snow, my hands shaking so badly I spilled more than I meant to. Carlisle noticed my pallor when I returned. He poured me whiskey without a word and slid the glass across the table. After a long silence, he said, "You stayed too close to the line, didn't you?" I nodded. His eyes softened, though his jaw remained tight. "They watch from there," he muttered. "Always have. That's their border, not ours." The rules guided every waking moment now. I carried them in my head, my heart, even in my dreams. Some nights I woke muttering them aloud, as if reminding myself I was still alive because I had followed them. And yet, for all my obedience, November brought me closer to vanishing than ever before. It happened during a patrol to the western cabins. The snow lay thick, knee-deep, and the air burned with cold so sharp it made my teeth ache. I trudged for hours, following stars when the river bent unpredictably, until the cabin finally appeared, its roof hunched beneath snowdrifts. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, grateful for shelter. But something was wrong. The stove was already lit, fire crackling cheerfully, though no one should have been there. On the table sat 3 mugs of steaming tea. Steam curled upward, fresh, fragrant. I froze. My breath fogged in the air as I whispered the rules to myself. Never trust what you find waiting. Never trust what pretends to be comfort. That rule wasn't written, but it might as well have been. Slowly, I backed out of the cabin, leaving the door ajar. I walked until the cabin was out of sight, then turned east instead, abandoning the patrol. I never told Carlo. I could not bear the weight of his knowing look, confirming what I feared, that the land was not only watching but inviting. The invitations came more often after that, lanterns drifting closer to the windows, voices murmuring beneath the floorboards, shadows pressing against the glass. Each time I resisted, obeying the rules, but each time it grew harder. The rules kept me alive, yes, but they did not protect me from the exhaustion, from the creeping erosion of self. I began to wonder if that was the true cost, not death, but slow surrender, piece by piece, until you no longer remembered who you were. Carlizal must have seen it in me. One night he said, "They'll test you. They always do. Don't let them wear you down. The rules aren't just for the land, they're for us. They remind us we're still here, still human." His words steadied me for a while, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. The worst test came at the very end of November. I had set out alone, tasked with checking boundary markers along the eastern ridge. The sky was bruised purple, heavy with snow, and I knew I had little daylight left. As I moved through the trees, I saw movement ahead, a lantern swinging gently, its light golden and warm. My breath caught. More lanterns followed, lining the path in perfect symmetry, each one glowing brighter than the last. They swayed in unison, beckoning. Rule 5 screamed in my mind, never follow lanterns off the trail. I forced myself to keep walking, eyes lowered. But as I passed, the lanterns shifted, moving with me, always just ahead, always forming a path. My pulse thundered. I whispered the rules over and over, refusing to look up. Then a voice joined the lights, my own voice, calling from just beyond the glow. Daniel, you're safe here." My stomach twisted. I clenched my fists and walked faster, until the lanterns flickered and vanished. When I finally looked back, only snow and darkness remained. But the echo of my own voice followed me long after, a shadow I could not shake. When I returned to the station, Carlizal was waiting. He studied me for a long time before asking, "Did you answer?" I shook my head. He exhaled slowly, relief flickering across his face. "Good," he said. "That's the only reason you came back." November ended with the rules carved deeper into my bones than any lesson I had ever learned. But as December loomed, with its endless nights and devouring storms, I began to fear that obedience alone might no longer be enough. Something in the land was growing hungrier, bolder, and I could feel it pressing closer every day. December in Alaska is not a month but a sentence. A long one without reprieve, without daylight, without mercy. The nights became longer than my mind could comfortably hold. Darkness pressed in on all sides, broken only by faint glimmers of starlight or the shifting curtains of aurora that rolled across the sky like living rivers. Beauty here has teeth. It lures you into staring too long, and while you stand transfixed, the silence reaches closer. Carlizal warned me that December was when most rangers broke. "The dark," he said, "doesn't just swallow light. It swallows time. Days, memory yourself if you're not careful. You'll think the rules are failing you, but that's when you need them most." He looked older than ever when he said this, his face carved deep with lines I hadn't noticed before. It struck me that he had likely spoken those words to others, to rangers who had not lived through December. The first week, I felt the strain immediately. I slept longer than I meant to, losing track of hours. Waking felt like surfacing from underwater, each breath tight, each thought sluggish. Sometimes I heard scratching on the windows though the shutters were closed. Once, when I forced myself to peek, frost had spread across the glass in patterns resembling words. Not in English, not in any language I recognized, but something that resembled script. I drew the shutters tight again and repeated the rules under my breath until the patterns faded by morning. We rarely left the station at night anymore. Carlisle forbade it outright. "You'll see things waiting for you in the dark," he said. "And if you step toward them, you won't come back." Still, the work required that we patrol. Supplies had to be checked, cabins cleared of snow, boundaries maintained. On one such patrol, I felt the rules tested harder than ever before. The path to the southern ridge was buried under snow. I trudged for hours, stars flickering faintly above, when my flashlight began to dim. I checked my watch, 2:55 a.m. I carried extra batteries, of course, but Rule 4 haunted me. Never use a flashlight after 3 in the morning. My heart pounded as the minutes slipped past. At 3, I switched it off, pocketing it with shaking hands. The darkness that followed was absolute. I forced my eyes to the sky, to the stars, and let them guide me. Yet in the corner of my vision, shapes moved. They weren't animals, they weren't people. They were outlines. Bent, shifting like trees that had learned to walk. They moved parallel to me, just out of sight, keeping pace. My lips moved silently, reciting the rules one by one like prayers. The shapes did not close in. They did not leave either. When I finally reached the ridge and the cabin beyond it, I collapsed inside, trembling, the silence pressing against the windows like a tide. The shapes never followed through the doorway. The rules had protected me again. Carlisle grew restless as December deepened. He paced often, staring at the radio as though expecting it to speak. One night he confessed something I had not wanted to hear. "I lost a partner here once," he said. "Good man, strong. He followed the rules, or at least I thought he did. But he stopped making offerings. Said it was silly, a waste of food. One night he went out to check a cabin and never came back. We found his boots a week later, set neatly by the river. Nothing else." His voice cracked slightly as he finished. "Don't ever forget the offerings, Daniel. It's not superstition. It's payment. I promised him I wouldn't, and I didn't. Every patrol, every night, I left something behind. Bread, salt, tobacco, whatever I had. Sometimes I felt the weight in the air lift afterward, as if something unseen had accepted the trade. Other times, the offerings lay untouched in the morning snow, and the silence seemed heavier for it. But I kept leaving them, because to stop would mean disrespect, and disrespect was death here. Around mid-December, the lanterns returned. I saw them from the station window, swaying just beyond the tree line. This time there were more than ever. 10, maybe 12, lined in perfect rows. Carlisle stood beside me, his jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. "You're getting bolder," he muttered. "Don't look too long." I tore my eyes away, but the glow lingered in my vision. A procession burned into my mind. All night they remained outside, swaying in silence, never approaching, never retreating. When dawn came, faint and gray, they were gone. Carlisle looked at me then, his face grim. "The rules are holding for now." But even the rules could not shield me from everything. December's longest night arrived with a storm that rattled the cabin to its bones. The wind howled like voices, carrying fragments of words that were not words. I sat awake, the raven carving clenched in my hand, listening as the storm grew louder. At 3 in the morning, the radio clicked on. Static filled the air, then my voice followed. "Daniel Whitaker, step outside." The words repeated, growing more insistent, until they blended with the wind, until I could no longer tell if they came from the radio or the storm itself. I turned the device off, but the voice continued. Carlisle rose from his bunk, his eyes bloodshot. He pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. We sat like that, 2 grown men clutching silence like a weapon, until dawn broke pale and weak. The voice faded only then, leaving behind a hollow stillness that felt worse than the storm. Later that day, Carlosel finally admitted what I had begun to suspect. "The rules aren't just for you," he said quietly. "They're for me too. For all of us. The land doesn't care how long we've been here. It only cares that we obey. The moment we stop, we're claimed." His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw fear in them, deep and raw. Carlosel, the man who had guided me through months of survival, was afraid. That frightened me more than the rules ever had. Toward the end of December, exhaustion gnawed at me. Sleep became fractured, broken by whispers and shifting shadows. I dreamed of the lanterns, of voices calling my name in tones that were mine and not mine. I dreamed of walking out into the snow barefoot, leaving offerings of my own blood, and waking to find small cuts on my hands that I could not explain. The rules could not protect me from dreams, and dreams bled too easily into waking life here. One night, close to the solstice, Carlosel failed to return from patrol on time. Hours passed. I paced the cabin, resisting the urge to break every rule and search for him in the dark. At last, near dawn, the door opened, and he stumbled inside, pale and trembling. His uniform was torn, his hands shaking violently. He would not speak of what had happened. He only muttered, "The wrong uniform," before collapsing onto his bunk. I left him be, though unease coiled inside me like a snake. If Carlosel, with all his years, could falter, what chance did I have? By the final days of December, I understood something I had not before. The rules were not shields. They were negotiations. Terms set by a land that tolerated me so long as I respected its conditions. But conditions can change, and bargains can be rewritten. Each day felt more precarious than the last, as though the ground beneath me had thinned to ice. I clung to the rules because they were all I had, but even as I obeyed, I wondered, what happens when the land decides the rules are no longer enough? That question haunted me as the year turned. The silence deepened. The lanterns swayed longer. The voices whispered clearer. And something in me knew that January would not be kinder. January arrived like a wound that refused to heal. The dark did not retreat, if anything. It grew heavier, thicker, more intent on swallowing what little light we carried. The snow pressed higher against the cabin walls, and the air cut sharper than any knife. Even Carlosel seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of winter. His silence was no longer that of a seasoned ranger conserving words. It was the silence of a man carrying too much. After his shaken return in late December, he barely left the cabin. He rose in the morning stiff and pale, pacing near the stove, muttering fragments of rules under his breath, as though afraid he would forget them. I asked once what had happened out there, when he stumbled back torn and trembling. He stared at me for a long time, his eyes glassy, and said only, "They wore my face, my uniform," and I almost believed it was me. Then he shook his head and refused to say more. His words rattled inside me, a warning that even recognition could be weaponized here. So it fell to me to take more patrols. I carried the rules like armor, repeating them as I trudged through deep snow, as I traced constellations to find my way, as I placed offerings in the hollows of trees that leaned too close. The forest had grown restless. Shapes moved just beyond sight, shadows that slid faster than wind, outlines that seemed to wait when I stopped walking. More than once I felt the pressure of eyes on me, not animal eyes, not human, but something that saw deeper than either. I left salt in heavy handfuls whenever that sensation grew too strong. One night, near the middle of January, I made a mistake. Fatigue had dulled me, and I left a ration wrapper outside after a hurried meal. I realized only hours later, long after the cabin had gone dark. The silence pressed heavier than usual, the kind that feels like 1,000 lungs holding breath. Carlosel sat up in his bunk, eyes fixed on the door. "You left something," he whispered. My stomach dropped. Before I could answer, the scratching began. Not on the windows this time, but on the roof. Long, dragging claws traced the shingles, circling, pausing above us. Snow sifted down through the rafters with each scrape. Carlisle's hands clenched white around his blanket. He mouthed the rule to me. Never leave food outside overnight. I nodded, trembling. We sat in rigid silence until dawn, the scratching steady above, never breaking rhythm. When the first gray light seeped into the sky, the sound stopped. I rushed outside to bury the wrapper in salt and bread, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The roof bore long gouges in the wood, each mark wider than my palm. Carlisle said nothing, but his eyes told me everything. One mistake, and we had nearly paid the price. The days blurred after that. Time had no edges in January. Sleep and waking folded together, dreams bleeding into reality, until I could not always separate them. Sometimes I dreamed of walking barefoot into the snow, following lanterns, my own voice guiding me. Sometimes I dreamed of Carlisle's face splitting, revealing something faceless beneath. I woke with my throat raw from shouting. Carlisle never mentioned the noise, though I knew he heard. Perhaps he was dreaming the same. Mid-January, the radio betrayed me again. I was alone in the cabin while Carlisle checked to supply cash. The radio hissed softly, then cleared. A voice filled the air. Not mine this time. My mother's. She spoke my name the way she had when I was a boy, gentle coaxing. Daniel, come home. Please. My chest tightened. She had been dead for 5 years, I knew this. And yet the voice was hers, perfect warm. Step outside, it said. I'll take you home. My fingers hovered over the switch, desperate, trembling. Rule 6 burned in my skull. If the radio picks up your own voice, or any voice that shouldn't be, turn it off immediately and wait until morning. I slammed it off, panting, and sat with my back against the stove until Carlisle returned. I told him nothing. His hollow eyes told me he already knew. The silence grew hungrier as January dragged on. Offerings disappeared faster, sometimes before I had even turned my back. Once, when I buried bread beneath the snow, I felt something cold and wet brush my hand, as though fingers had reached up from below to take it. I recoiled, but the offering was gone, and the pressure in the air eased. Payment accepted. My stomach turned, but my heart steadied. The bargain was still intact. Carlisle, however, was unraveling. He muttered to himself constantly now, pacing the cabin, writing rules over and over in his journal until the pages blurred with ink. They change faces, he told me one night, his eyes wide. That's how they get in. They'll wear mine or yours. Don't answer. Don't believe. His voice broke, and for the first time I saw tears gather at the corners of his eyes. It shook me. Carlisle had always been a pillar of control, a man forged by years in this wilderness. To see him bend was to feel the weight of inevitability pressing down. If he could break, so could I. At the end of January, the lanterns returned once more. I had gone to check the eastern ridge, snow up to my waist, when I saw them through the trees. Dozens now, swaying in rows that curved into the darkness like a procession without end. My throat closed. They moved in perfect rhythm, slow and patient. My own voice drifted from among them, calm and insistent. Daniel, just one step. Just one. I gritted my teeth and turned away, forcing myself forward through the snow. The lanterns followed parallel to me, never closer, never farther, always waiting. When I stumbled, nearly falling, the voice sharpened. You're tired. Let us carry you. I shoved onward, gasping, until at last the ridge curved and the lights vanished behind me. When I reached the cabin again, Carlisle was waiting, pale and hollow. They came for you too, he said. It was not a question. That night, I lay awake listening to him mutter the rules in his bunk. His voice was steady, but the words came faster, fraying into desperation. I realized then that the rules were not just survival, they were identity. Without them, you forgot who you were, and once you forgot, the land claimed you. I clung to them harder than ever, repeating them under my breath, until I finally drifted into uneasy sleep. The final night of January brought the worst storm yet. Wind shrieked like thousands of voices, shaking the cabin walls. Snow battered the shutters, rattling them as if fists pounded from outside. The stove flickered, threatening to die. Carlosel sat rigid, his eyes unfocused, lips moving silently. Then, through the storm, a knock sounded at the door. 3 sharp raps. My heart stopped. Carlosel looked at me, his face ashen. The knock came again, followed by a voice. My voice. Daniel, let me in. The rules screamed at me, do not respond. Do not open. I sat frozen, breath shallow, while the voice repeated, each knock louder, more insistent. Carlosel gripped my arm, whispering, don't believe it. Don't you dare. I nodded, shaking violently. The storm raged for hours, the voice and knocking blending with the wind until I could barely tell them apart. When dawn finally came, weak and pale, the knocking ceased. I opened the door cautiously. Snow lay thick, undisturbed, no tracks leading to or from the cabin. Only emptiness, only silence. Carlosel slumped in his chair, eyes red, hands trembling. They're trying harder, he whispered. They know we're tired. His voice cracked with something that might have been grief or surrender. I had no words. I only clutched the raven carving in my pocket and whispered the rules under my breath until the silence felt tolerable again. January ended not with relief, but with dread for what February might bring. The rules had held barely, but the land was growing hungrier, and I could not shake the sense that it was watching us more closely now, waiting for the moment we faltered. February arrived without ceremony, only a deepening of the silence, a thickening of the dark, as though the land had decided it was finished toying with us and now meant to see what we were truly made of. By then, Carlosel looked gaunt, his beard untrimmed, his eyes sunk into hollows. He no longer wrote in his journal. Instead, he stared for hours at the radio, lips moving soundlessly, his hand resting on the switch as though debating whether to turn it on. I worried he might give in, might answer whatever voices called. But I never dared confront him directly. To accuse was to risk pushing him closer to the edge. I clung to the rules harder than ever. They had kept me alive this long, but I knew survival was no guarantee. February carried the scent of final tests, as if the land had decided the bargain had dragged on too long. The offerings disappeared instantly now. Bread, salt, tobacco, gone the moment I set them down, taken by unseen hands. Sometimes the snow beneath my offerings trembled, as if something moved just under the surface, swallowing what I left. I forced myself not to stare. Payment accepted was payment enough. One night early in the month, Carlosel vanished. I woke to an empty bunk, the door slightly ajar, snow blown in across the threshold. Panic clawed my throat. I bundled up and stepped into the dark, whispering the rules under my breath like prayers. The air was utterly still, the silence pressed tight. No wind, no sound. Only faint lantern light glimmering deep between the trees. My stomach turned. Rule 5 pounded in my skull. Never follow lanterns off the trail. And yet, what if Carlosel had? My boots crunched softly in the snow. I called his name once, a whisper, before biting it back. The silence seemed to lean closer at the sound. I returned to the cabin, heart hammering, and waited. Hours passed. Just before dawn, the door creaked open and Carlosel stumbled in, face pale, coat torn. He would not meet my eyes. He only muttered, "Wrong uniform, wrong face," and collapsed into his bunk. I never asked again. The days dragged on, each one a repetition of cold, hunger, and dread. Then came the night when the rules bent under pressure in a way I had never imagined. It was past midnight, the stove burning low, when the scratching began again on the roof. At first I thought it was the same as before, claws dragging across wood. But then the sound shifted, rhythmic like writing. I froze. Carlisle sat rigid in his chair, his face blank. "They're writing," he whispered. The scratches grew louder, carving deep grooves into the roof beams. Dust fell into my hair, stinging my eyes. I wanted to cover my ears, but some part of me needed to hear, to know. The scratches formed a pattern, a cadence that felt almost like letters. My name, over and over, gouged into the roof above us. Daniel. Each strike rattled the cabin walls. Carlisle clamped his hands over his ears and shouted, "Don't listen." But I could not block it out. Not until dawn, when the scratching ceased and silence returned, leaving my name etched deep into the wood above. I lay awake until daylight, staring at those letters, wondering if recognition itself was now a trap. By mid-February, Carlisle had begun to fade. He rarely ate. He rarely slept. One evening, as the aurora rippled faint green across the sky, he took my hand in his skin cold as ice. "If I don't make it," he said quietly, "remember the rules. Pass them on. That's all that matters. The land doesn't care about us. It only cares that we know." His words chilled me more than the wind ever could. That night I dreamed of plaques covered in names, endless lists of rangers, each one etched into stone. My own name was already there. The end came in the last week of February. A storm raged outside, wind screaming, snow hammering the shutters. The stove hissed weakly, struggling against the cold. Carlisle sat hunched near the radio, his hands shaking violently. I begged him not to touch it. He looked up at me with hollow eyes and said, "I hear her. My daughter. She's calling me." My chest seized. I had never known he had a daughter. Before I could stop him, he flicked the switch. Static burst, then a voice filled the cabin. A girl's voice, high and soft, whispering, "Daddy, come outside." Carlisle broke. Tears streamed down his face as he rose, stumbling toward the door. I grabbed his arm, shouting, but his strength surprised me. He tore free, flung the door open, and stepped into the storm. The wind swallowed him instantly. I screamed his name, but the darkness consumed him. The door slammed shut with the force of the wind, leaving me alone in the silence. Alone with the rules. I waited until dawn before daring to step outside. Snow covered everything, piled high, erasing all sign of him. No footprints, no trail, only the storm's aftermath. I searched, but it was hopeless. Carlisle was gone, whether claimed, lost, or simply erased. I would never know. I returned to the cabin, my chest hollow, my throat raw. I sat at the table and read the rules again, each one etched deeper into me than ever before. They were all I had left. The final days of February were a blur of solitude and silence. I spoke the rules aloud constantly, filling the cabin with my voice so the silence would not claim it. I made offerings until my supplies dwindled, watching them vanish instantly. I refused to touch the radio. I refused to look at lanterns. I refused to answer the voices that called from the trees, from the roof, from the very air. I refused everything but the rules. They were my last tether. On the final night of February, I dreamed, or perhaps I did not dream, that Carlisle stood at the tree line, his face pale, his uniform torn. He lifted a hand, beckoning. "Daniel," he called softly. "It's safe now. Come!" My heart ached. Every instinct screamed to run to him, but the rules thundered louder. Wrong uniform, wrong face. Do not answer. I turned away, tears burning hot down my cheeks, and when I looked back, the tree line was empty. March came at last, the light lengthening by the faintest margin. Dawn lingering longer, nights retreating by minutes. It felt like mercy, but not forgiveness. The land had tolerated me through the winter, but only just. I knew this reprieve was temporary. The rules had saved me, yes, but they were not victory. They were survival. Survival is not the same as living. I sat at the table, staring at Carlizal's empty bunk, and realized I was now the one who had to pass the rules on. Someone else would come. Another ranger. Another fool who thought they understood wilderness. I would hand them the list, just as Carlizal had handed it to me. I would say the same words, follow them. Everyone. If you don't, you won't last the winter. And I would watch as they learned, as I had, that Alaska does not forgive, only bargains. And I am a park ranger in Alaska. I have survived, not because I am strong, not because I am clever, but because I obeyed. The rules are not guidance. They are law. And though I still breathe, I do not know how much of me belongs to myself anymore, and how much belongs to the silence that waits just beyond the trees.